One of the trickiest things about flush draws is knowing when to keep your foot on the gas and continue barreling, and when to pump the brakes and consider checking instead. That's what we're going to talk about in this video with an ace-king flush draw. Good morning, how are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Welcome back to another video. Today we're going to review a hand from the full episode of vlog number 5. Leave a link for the full episode down in the description box below, but let's get right into it, playing 1-2 over in Orange City. So in this hand we are in the hijack. There's a $5 straddle under the gun. Look down at ace king of clubs. Very, very pretty, no complaints so far. Both the players in front of me limp, decide to attack at this point. There's really zero reason to limp this behind, and I decide to go to 30. Totally standard. Maybe it could be 35 or 40, but I thought 30 was going to get the job done and be a totally fine raise size here. End up getting called by the original straddler, fold by the first limper. Second limper comes along as well. Go three-way to a flop of 7-5-5 with a single club. Both players end up checking over to us. And I decide to fire for 35. Now, since we're not playing this in real time and we have the luxury to take as much time as we want while exploring this, I think it's really useful to pull out a solver. Now, this is a multi-way situation, so I'm going to be using the simple three-way solver, which I think is extremely good for solving out spots like this. And when we look through it, and after taking the both players check to us and we decide to fire for 35, I like to first and foremost see if the hand we actually have is showing up in our betting range. And if we click on ace king suited, look at ace king of clubs specifically, you notice that the solver does like firing here and is firing here pretty much all of the time. So this is going to be a totally fine fire as far as the solver is concerned. Now, obviously, when it comes to a solver overall, one of the major things is that a solver is saying, okay, both you and your opponents are going to play totally perfect from here on out. Now, obviously, we are not going to be doing that since we're humans and we can't just implement a purely perfect GTO strategy, and our opponents are human and are not going to do the same. But a solver is still very, very useful for getting a broad strokes look at what the solver would suggest in a spot like this. And if you have no idea, I would suggest starting with a solver and then saying, okay, well, how do I exploit based upon how my opponents are likely going to deviate from the solver's solution? And for what it's worth, one of the other things I like to do in a solver, other than just see if our exact hole cards are liked by the action and actual size chosen, is I like to look at our opponents and what the solver thinks they should be doing and see if our opponents are likely anywhere close to that just based upon the assumptions and information that we have on them. So after we bet for 35, one of the things that's interesting, if we look at player 1, so the person who straddled in the first place, you actually notice that the calls are in yellow, and they should be calling with things like ace queen and some king queens. And if we look at, like, say an ace 10 and get really granular with it, you notice that a lot of the hands that they're supposed to be check calling with are actually things like the overcards and backdoor flush draw. So ace 10 of spades, ace 10 of hearts, ace 10 of clubs, which they can't have because we actually have ace king of clubs in this exact hand, but I digress. So it gives you some way of measuring that and saying, okay, this is what our opponents should actually be doing. And then say, wait, like, would my opponent actually do this? Are they going to call wider than this? Are they actually going to raise appropriately? Obviously, they're continuing with all the pairs, but are they continuing with other stuff at an appropriate frequency as well? Or are they more likely to be making overfolding mistakes or maybe overcontinuance mistakes? I don't think the average person here is going to be check raising 10s and 9s. But, you know, there are certain players that do. I don't think this particular opponent was likely to do that, which of course is baked into the solver itself. The solver says, hey, at this point, everyone's going to play totally perfect GTO. Obviously, I don't assume that my opponents or any human opponents are going to be doing that, so keep that in the back of your mind, so that can help you understand, okay, how should you be deviating from the solver itself. So as it ends up playing out in this exact situation, again, we bet for 35. Get called in both spots. Turn is an interesting card, giving us the backdoor flush draw, so that is the 3 of clubs specifically, and both players check to us. So let's talk about it and look at the solver once again and see what the solver says we should do in this spot. So going back to simple three-way, let's look at the flop action, just dial all that in. So player 1 calls. Player 1 calls, player 2 calls, go to the turn, player 1 checks, player 2 checks, and player 3 us. What are we doing in this situation? So let's just look at what we should be betting. Click on Ace King suited. Again, we have Ace King of clubs. So it looks like it wants us to be checking this, and checking is going to be slightly higher EV than a roughly half pot bet or even a shove. So checking is the preferred action with our exact Ace King of clubs in this hand. So if you're paying very close attention here, you may have actually noticed something when looking at the way the solver is structuring itself on the turn. Obviously, the 3 of clubs is a very low card. One of the things I'm definitely keeping in mind in a hand like this is that if my opponent has a 7, either of them, I think they're going to feel way more comfortable and continue a good chunk of the time when they have that kind of hand. But you notice something, that the checks are in yellow, the bets are in green, and you notice which kind of pair hands are being bet and which kinds are being checked. You notice the more vulnerable pairs, 8s, 9s, 10s, jacks, and a lot of queens, are actually in the bet side of the spectrum, whereas the less vulnerable pairs like aces and kings are actually getting checked at a pretty high frequency, which may be a little shocking to some people, but if you work with solvers enough, you start to find patterns like that out pretty darn quickly. And another thing you can do is you can go over here, empty this out, and say, okay, well, how are you specifically playing ace high flush draws? Because that's kind of one of the more interesting hands in this kind of range. And you notice that the, again, more vulnerable stuff, things like ace 10, ace jack, is pretty much all bets. And then as soon as you start getting into the ace king, ace queen, now all of a sudden that starts to be a lot of checking with those stronger flush draws, since those hands inherently have more showdown value against the kind of continuance hands that our opponent both has right this moment and the way the solver thinks it's going to play that going forward. So it's one of the other ways that you can kind of use a solver to identify patterns like this, especially on turns and rivers. So keep that in mind if you've never really explored with a solver before, whether it's a multi-way solver like Simple 3-Way or a heads-up solver like GTO Plus. So again, the solver is totally on board with our play here with checking the turn. River comes off, and unfortunately bricks our flush draw, 2 checks to us, and I decide to end up checking this behind after taking a moment to think about whether or not to fire this. And as usual, let's take a moment, look at the solver, and see if the solver also likes checking this behind as well. So when the river is the 9 of spades, there's a check, and let's just quickly look and see what our solver likes doing. Again, the checks are in yellow, and you notice that ace king of clubs is pretty much all checks. There's a little bit of firing that it's okay with, but ultimately it's definitely liking about 90% of the time for this to be a check, and I see no reason to deviate from it. Again, if you're looking at the solver strategy overall, you notice that a lot of the bets are in the strong pair side of the spectrum, turns some of the weaker whiffed hands like king 10 off into bluffs and king 10 suited as well, but ultimately that's the way that it is structuring its overall strategy here. So as it totally pans out, it looks like the line that we decided to take here, with lots of checking on the turn and river and then the actual bet itself on the flop, the solver seems pretty darn happy with our overall play with ace king of clubs here, and I'm pretty happy with it overall as well. And I'm made even happier when I flip my hand over and one of the limpers decides to show ace jack off, the other person mucks, and somehow we end up getting this pot shipped over to us, which is always great when A, you're in alignment with the solver, and B, you end up winning the pot. That's always wonderful, no complaints whatsoever. So the big takeaways, other than understanding some of the stuff that goes into solvers, is really understanding when you have flush draws, thinking about what kind of showdown value your hand does or does not have. If you work with the solver enough, one of the biggest patterns you're going to find out is that when there is more vulnerability, the solver tends to be more in line with just firing it, whereas when you have more inherent showdown value, that hand could reasonably win if the whole hand gets checked down. The solver can be much more on board with playing it a little bit slower. The other thing to keep in mind in this hand is, based upon how big the pot was, if we do end up improving on the river, well, we can probably get stacks in anyway, which is pretty darn easy. We don't have to panic about feeling like we have to get a bet in on the turn in order to set up for big pots on the river when we do end up improving. So keep that in mind when it comes to this situation. Things like stack depth are going to be very, very important here, not just making blind auto blanket assumptions that don't necessarily work in all situations. So keep that in mind. And if you're interested in doing this kind of work and more work like it, I would definitely suggest picking up Simple 3-Way. It is an excellent GTO solver for multi-way pots. And if you play a lot of multi-way pots, especially if you play things like Live 1-2, Live 2-5, and a lot of micro online cash games, this can be extremely valuable since multi-way pots are much more common there. So if you use the link splitsuit.com/simple3way, it'll automatically apply a 10% discount for you at checkout, and I would definitely suggest checking it out if you're serious about doing these kind of solves. It's extremely, extremely helpful. So hopefully that helps you wrap your head around flush draws and where and when to think about taking free cards versus just continue barreling. Same as always, if you have any comments or questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. And by the way, if you like this, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more hands from this exact session, I'll leave a link in the description box for the full episode. Again, this was vlog episode number 5. If you need anything, let me know. Otherwise, I'll see you shortly with a brand new video. In the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.